To understand the Viking, you must first understand the place that shaped him, Scandinavia. It is a land of raw, untamed beauty. A vast, fractured coastline carved by retreating glaciers, creating the dramatic, deep-cut inlets known as fjords. In Norway, flatland for farming was a rare and precious luxury. Mountains plunged straight into the sea, trapping communities in isolated valleys, where life was a perpetual, grim struggle against the cold and the rock. The climate was not forgiving. Winters were long, dark, and brutal. A single poor harvest could spell starvation for an entire community. This harsh environment instilled two crucial elements into the northern spirit: resilience and a deep-seated wanderlust. They had to look outward to survive. The ocean was not a barrier, it was the highway. These communities, known as jarls or clans, were fiercely independent. Their social structure was rigid. At the top was the jarl, the leader, the commander, and the lawgiver. Beneath him were the carls, the free men, the farmers, and the warriors, and at the bottom, the thralls, slaves captured in raids or purchased through trade. Honor was everything. Dishonor meant exile or worse. By the late 8th century, the traditional decentralized way of life was under threat. The cause was a rising political force: consolidation. Powerful petty kings began fighting and uniting the small kingdoms of Norway under a single crown. The most famous of these unifying figures was Harald Fairhair. Harald was ruthless and driven. His ambition was to rule all of Norway. His consolidation meant that local jarls and carls were increasingly forced to submit their land, their wealth, and their independence to the central authority of a king. 4. A generation of proud, land-owning men, this was an intolerable change. Many jarls had spent their lives free, controlling their own destiny and their own sea lanes. Now they were subjects, forced to pay taxes and render service to a distant ruler. Harald Fairhair's success, though it brought a form of unity to Norway, had an unexpected consequence. It created thousands of exiles. Free men who refused to live under a king's thumb had only one choice: sail west and seek new land, new wealth, and new freedom. They became the first true Vikings, a word that, at its root, simply meant to go on an expedition or raid. The political pressures at home, combined with a natural desire for better farmland and silver, filled the decks of the longships. The Viking expansion would have been impossible without their signature technology, the longship. This vessel was not merely a boat. It was an evolutionary leap in naval architecture, a masterpiece of medieval engineering that granted them absolute strategic superiority. The longship was defined by two revolutionary traits. First, the keel. Unlike the flat-bottom boats of their local rivers, the longship featured a sturdy central keel. This allowed it to handle the ferocious deep-sea swells of the North Atlantic, giving the Vikings the stability to cross oceans others dared not attempt. Second, the shallow draft. Despite the deep keel, the sides of the ship were light and the hull was extremely shallow. This meant the longship could be sailed across vast oceans, then effortlessly rowed right onto a beach or up a shallow river. A warship could bypass fortifications, penetrate deep inland to attack unsuspecting targets, and retreat back to the sea before any substantial defense could be mounted. A typical longship was 60 to 80 feet long, propelled by a single square sail of heavy woolen cloth and rowed by 30 to 60 men. Every man was a warrior, and every ship was a floating fortress. They were fast, quiet, and terrifyingly efficient. The Vikings weren't just sailing, they were using a military-grade technology that gave them control over both land and sea, allowing them to strike anywhere in Europe, from the far reaches of Ireland to the rivers of Russia. The world was suddenly within their reach. The stage was set, the ships were ready, the men were eager. All that was needed was a target. And that target would be an island nation, rich in gold, complacent in its peace, and entirely unprepared for the fury about to descend upon its shores. In the year 793 AD, the world of Christian Europe was a place of relative, if fragile, peace. The powerful Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne dominated the continent, and the isolated kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria were focused on internal squabbles and the quiet pursuit of piety. In England, the focus of spiritual life was the monastery. These holy sites were not just places of prayer, they were the centers of literacy, culture, and wealth. Unlike the rough, warrior-driven societies of the north, the monks believed in peace and the power of the word. They held vast treasuries of silver, gold, and precious jewels, offerings left by centuries of devout nobles. Crucially, monasteries adhered to the strict principle of non-violence. They were entirely unarmed, positioned usually on isolated coasts or islands to ensure solitude. They were seen as sacred, inviolable ground, and none was more sacred or more tragically exposed than Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne, often called the Holy Island, was a small, wave-battered outcrop off the coast of Northumbria in northeast England. It was a place steeped in spiritual history, the burial site of the great Saint Cuthbert, and home to some of the most precious relics and illuminated manuscripts in Christendom, including the famous Lindisfarne Gospels. The monks of Lindisfarne lived in quiet reverence, their lives dictated by the bells, the tides, and the word of God. Their treasures lay largely unhidden, protected by their sacred status, a security measure that had held for 2 centuries. They represented the ultimate tempting paradox for a ruthless, cash-strapped warrior society: maximum wealth with minimum defense. To the Viking captains sailing across the North Sea, Lindisfarne was not a holy site. It was simply the largest, richest, and most exposed bank vault in Europe. The attack was not expected. The summer of 793 had been unremarkable. The monks went about their daily routines, watching the horizon, not for invaders, but perhaps for the sails of friendly fishing boats or merchants. Then one clear morning, the ships appeared. They weren't the familiar, bulky trading vessels. They were lean, low, and fast, the unmistakable silhouette of the Longship. They flew no flag that could be recognized. They carried no friendly intent. Their carved dragon prows cut swiftly through the water, aimed straight for the unprotected beaches of the island. The monks, who had never known war, watched in horror. They had no army, no walls designed for defense, only wooden doors and locks meant to keep out the wind, not a tide of armed fury. What followed was a moment of singular, defining horror that would shape the Western world's view of the Viking for 1,000 years. The Northmen, their axes glittering, came ashore with savage speed. They were terrifying in their appearance. Tall, broad-shouldered, their hair often tied back, their beards braided, wearing leather and metal, driven by a roar that was alien and utterly without mercy. They were driven not just by greed, but by a warrior culture that valued fury in combat. The monks, incapable of resistance, were cut down where they stood, in the choir, in the cloisters, even at the altar. Blood mixed with the gold dust and ink of illuminated texts. Those who were not immediately killed were bound and dragged away as thralls, slaves to be sold in the eastern markets, forever stripped of their freedom. The Vikings did not hesitate to desecrate the holy sanctuary. They tore apart the altars, smashed the relics, and stripped the monastery of every piece of precious metal. The sight of them defiling the sacred resting place of St. Cuthbert was a shock that traveled through the Christian world like a thunderbolt. News traveled slowly, but when it arrived, the reaction was immediate and profound. This was not a border skirmish or a tribal raid. This was an assault on Christianity itself. The greatest evidence of the shock comes from Alcuin of York, a renowned scholar and advisor to Charlemagne. Alcuin wrote frantic letters to the King of Northumbria and the remaining monks, expressing an overwhelming sense of terror and disbelief. He asked, "What security can there be for the churches of Britain if St. Cuthbert's chief church has been destroyed by pagans?" He saw the raid not just as violence, but as a potential sign of divine displeasure, a punishment from God. This single act in 793 AD did three crucial things that launched the Viking Age. It established a pattern. The Vikings learned that isolated, wealthy and undefended targets were the easiest way to acquire massive fortunes. It provided the resources. The massive influx of Lindisfarne gold and silver financed further, larger expeditions. It created the legend. The story of the blood and fire turned the Vikings into a supernatural, terrifying force in the European imagination, a psychological advantage they would use for centuries. The Viking Age had begun. They had tasted Christian wealth, and they would not stop until they had plundered the entire world of the West. The success at Lindisfarne immediately changed the Northmen's focus from mere survival to organized strategic conquest. They realized they didn't just need new land. They needed the wealth to buy influence, build larger fleets, and secure their own growing power base back in Scandinavia. The raids became more frequent and more geographically ambitious. From 793 onward, the coasts of Scotland, Ireland, and continental Europe would never again know true peace. The era of the seasonal raid had arrived. The Vikings would return to Scandinavia for the harsh winter, laden with silver and slaves. But they would return every spring, bolder and in larger numbers, knowing exactly where the best targets lay. The lesson of Lindisfarne was brutal. The world of quiet prayer was over. From this day forward, every coastal community, every riverside town, every great city would have to look nervously to the sea, listening for the quiet, dreadful sound of the longships hitting the shore. The raids on Lindisfarne and countless other coastal monasteries were profitable, but they were limited. The Vikings operated as pirates, striking fast and retreating before any organized resistance could rally. By the middle of the 9th century, this was no longer enough. The ambitions of the Northmen had grown. They no longer wanted just silver, they wanted land and rule. The impetus for this massive shift is often traced to a powerful, perhaps even legendary name, Ragnar Lodbrok. Ragnar was the quintessential Viking hero, a successful raider, a feared king, and the subject of countless sagas. The sagas claim that he was eventually captured by King Ella of Northumbria in England and executed by being thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. Whether true or folklore, this story provided the perfect, compelling motive for the largest invasion force Scandinavia had ever assembled. This was not a raid for gold. This was a blood feud on a grand, terrifying scale. In 865 AD, an immense fleet descended upon the shores of East Anglia. Chroniclers immediately called it the Great Heathen Army. Its objective was nothing less than the conquest and division of the entire island of Britain. Leading this enormous host were the legendary sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, men whose names struck terror into the hearts of Saxons for generations. They were strategists, political operators, and warriors of unmatched ferocity. The most prominent commanders included Ivar the Boneless, the brilliant, chilling strategist. Legend says he was carried into battle on a shield due to a physical disability, but his mind was his weapon. Halfdan Ragnarsson, the merciless military commander, focused on establishing permanent settlements. Uba, the fiercely loyal, battle-hungry brother, often associated with the most brutal actions. This was not a disorganized band of raiders. This was a unified professional military force operating with a clear chain of command and a devastatingly simple goal: dismantle the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Great Heathen Army operated with a tactical sophistication that bewildered their English opponents. They abandoned the smash-and-grab methods of their fathers. Instead, they relied on two main strategies. First, the winter camp. Instead of sailing home in the autumn, the army established heavily fortified winter camps, or burhs. These were earthwork, fortifications, often utilizing existing Roman ruins or natural river bends. They could not be easily starved or assaulted. This signaled their intent. They were here to stay. Second, mobility and horsepower. While Vikings were rarely cavalrymen in the traditional sense, they were brilliant at acquiring and utilizing horses from the local populace to increase their speed. They became a terrifyingly mobile force, able to outmaneuver the slow-moving regional Saxon levies and strike deep inland where they were least expected. They systematically targeted the great centers of power. East Anglia bought them off with silver, gaining a brief, uneasy peace. Then the Vikings turned their attention to the wealth of Northumbria and the political prize of York. In 867 AD, the sons of Ragnar took York. When King Ella, the man who allegedly killed their father, was captured, the Vikings extracted their vengeance in a horrifying ritual known as the Blood Eagle. Though modern historians debate its truth, the legend of this brutal execution cemented the Viking reputation for cold, ritualistic cruelty. By 871 AD, three of the four major English kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, had been conquered, dismantled, or severely crippled. The Vikings were consolidating power, installing puppet rulers, and carving out vast territories that would soon be known as the Danelaw, a huge portion of eastern England where Danish law and culture prevailed. England was on the brink of complete collapse. Only one kingdom remained standing, a small, marshy territory in the southwest, Wessex. And standing in the path of the Viking tide was the man who would come to define English resistance, King Alfred. Alfred, King of Wessex, was not the typical warrior king. He was intelligent, intensely pious, and surprisingly scholarly. But above all, he was a pragmatic military genius. In the early years of the invasion, Alfred faced relentless defeats. The Vikings chased him across his lands, eventually forcing him into ignominious retreat into the remote muddy marshes of Athelney. Legend paints a picture of a broken king hiding out, almost anonymous. But Athelney became Alfred's crucible. It was here, in 878 AD, that he devised a multi-pronged strategy for survival that would eventually turn the tide of history. Alfred realized that the Viking success relied on surprise, speed, and the lack of a standing Saxon army. His counter-strategy was revolutionary, the Boer system. Alfred didn't just fortify winter camps, he created a national network of permanent garrisoned fortresses known as burhs. These well-planned circular defenses were positioned strategically so that no place in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a safe haven. This protected the population and denied the Vikings the easy plunder they needed to sustain their army. Standing army. He reformed the traditional Saxon levy, Fyrd. Instead of calling up all farmers at once, ruining the harvest, Alfred divided his military force in two, one half fighting, one half farming. This allowed him to maintain a constant ready force in the field for the first time. Naval power. Alfred understood the Longship was the key. He ordered the construction of his own fleet, ships designed specifically to counter the Viking vessels. While his early attempts were mixed, he is recognized as the founder of the English Royal Navy. The culmination of Alfred's strategy came in the spring of 878 AD at the Battle of Edington. Alfred emerged from the marshes of Athelney, calling upon the men of Wessex to join him. The combined force met the massive Viking army, now led by the formidable warlord Guthrum. The battle was a desperate, chaotic, close-quarters fight that lasted for hours. The fate of Anglo-Saxon England, its culture, its language, its eventual national identity, hung on every clash of axe and shield. Alfred's disciplined defense and the morale of his unified army held firm. The Vikings, stunned by the organized resistance, finally broke. Guthrum was utterly defeated. His army was shattered, and he was forced to surrender to Alfred. The terms of the treaty were as important as the battle itself. It wasn't just a military surrender, it was a cultural one. Guthrum and his remaining captains were forced to convert to Christianity, with Alfred acting as Guthrum's godfather. The treaty also formalized the division of England, establishing the Danelaw, the lands in the east and north where Vikings ruled under their own laws, and establishing Wessex as the dominant, surviving Anglo-Saxon power in the south and west. The Viking conquest of England was halted. It was a ceasefire, not an end to the fight. But Alfred had saved his kingdom and guaranteed the continuation of English identity. He earned the title Alfred the Great, the only English monarch in history to ever receive that honor. The Vikings had learned that England would no longer be a soft target. They would now be forced to look elsewhere for their fortunes. The relentless pressure of warfare pushed the Northmen into new avenues of expansion, from simple raiding to sophisticated trade and incredible, unprecedented exploration. The stunning resistance led by Alfred the Great in the west forced the Vikings to confront a hard truth. The coastal plunder of Western Europe was becoming too difficult, too costly, and too slow. A few lucky raids were no longer enough to satisfy the demands of their massive armies. The Viking strategic mind, ever pragmatic, sought new avenues for wealth. And they found it not across the choppy waters of the Atlantic, but through the vast, open, and largely undefended river systems of the east. The axe would now be supplemented by the ledger. This eastern branch of the Vikings, primarily Swedes, were less concerned with conquering large kingdoms and more obsessed with connecting the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea to the markets of the north. They were becoming, in essence, global logistics experts. They called themselves the Rus, a name derived from the Old Norse term for the men who row, a title focused not on aggression, but on their primary method of travel and trade. The Rus would do more than just trade. They would plant the seeds of what would eventually become the Russian state. Eastern Europe, vast and flat, was defined by two massive rivers that snaked their way south and east, the Dnieper and the Volga. To the Rus, these were not obstacles, but grand highways to the most powerful and wealthy empires of the age. They became known as the water roads, or the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, map showing the Dnieper and Volga routes. The Vikings quickly mastered these waterways, adapting their longships for river travel by adding removable mast, steps, and developing techniques to pull their boats over long stretches of land, a maneuver known as portage. Their trading methodology was elegant and terrifyingly efficient. They would sail south from the Baltic, stopping in Slavic and Finnish settlements along the route to acquire the highest value, lowest weight goods available. Furs, luxurious pelts of beaver, sable, and fox, coveted by the elite of the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. Honey and wax, essential for sweetening and candle making, high demand, low supply in the south. Slaves, thralls, by far their most profitable commodity. The Vikings captured Slavic tribesmen, Finns, and even fellow Scandinavians, moving human cargo south to the massive slave markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate. The final destination of this grim trade was either Constantinople, the great city of the Greeks, or Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic Caliphate. The most coveted prize at the end of the Dnieper route was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. To the Vikings, it was simply Miklagard, the great city. Constantinople was the richest and most sophisticated city in the known world. Its walls were legendary, its markets overflowing with silks, spices, wine and gold. The Rus longed to trade with it, but first they had to survive. The journey, the Dnieper route, was a brutal gauntlet. As the river approached the Black Sea, it was interrupted by a series of 9 deadly rapids and waterfalls. To pass them, the Rus had to unload their ships, disassemble them where possible, and drag their heavy boats and precious cargo for miles, across uneven terrain, constantly vulnerable to ambushes by nomadic Pecheneg tribesmen. Once they reached Miklagard, the relationship was complex. The Rus were often viewed by the Byzantine emperor as barbarians, but necessary ones. The interaction swung violently between war and commerce. The Vikings launched several massive attacks on the city, aiming to force the Byzantine emperor to grant them more favorable trading rights. In 860 AD and later in the 940s, Viking fleets attacked the city's harbor. They never breached the legendary walls, but their ability to deliver massive armies directly to the capital forced the empire's hand. The result: treaties that granted the Rus special market access and, crucially, employment. The fiercest Viking warriors were recruited to serve in the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal elite bodyguard. Clad in mail and wielding their signature axes, these Norse mercenaries were renowned for their loyalty to the emperor and their ferocity in battle. They saw service from Sicily to Armenia, and their pay was legendary, making Constantinople one of the greatest sources of Viking wealth. The second great artery, the Volga River, was perhaps even more extraordinary. This route steered east, deep into the heart of the Eurasian continent, and led directly to the Caspian Sea, opening the doors to the powerful Abbasid Caliphate, the sprawling Islamic empire that stretched to Baghdad. Here, the Vikings were entering a world far more advanced, urban, and wealthy than Western Europe. Islamic civilization valued silver above all, and the Rus delivered the goods the caliphate demanded. High-quality furs from the northern forests, and the steady stream of Slavic slaves. The archaeological evidence of this exchange is stunning. In graves and treasure hoards across Scandinavia, historians have uncovered tens of thousands of Kufic dirhams, silver coins from the Islamic world. These massive silver hoards, far larger than any found from the raids in England or France, prove that the Eastern trade was exponentially more profitable than the Western plunder. The Vikings were essentially the middlemen, bridging the enormous economic gap between the underdeveloped forests of the north and the advanced, silver-rich cities of the Islamic south. As the trade routes flourished, the Rus began to move from summer trading posts to permanent fortified settlements. They didn't just pass through the Slavic lands, they began to rule them. In the grand narrative of the Vikings, the flash of the axe and the roar of the Longship often overshadow the cold, hard economic reality. The success of the Viking Age, their ability to build permanent settlements, fund massive expeditions, and establish powerful dynasties, was founded upon two commodities: silver and slavery. The seasonal raid for plunder soon gave way to a year-round, industrialized system of capturing and selling human cargo. This was the dark engine that powered the North. The highest value product for the Vikings was not the silk they desired from Constantinople, nor the wine they bought from France. It was the thrall, the Viking term for a slave. The thrall class was the foundational cornerstone of Viking society, providing the manual labor for farms and the necessary manpower for trading expeditions. Thralls were acquired in three main ways: capture, in raids; the most common source. Monks, farmers, women and children were snatched from the coasts of Ireland, Scotland and England during the great seasonal raids. Debt and crime. Free men could be reduced to slavery through severe debt or as punishment for major crimes. The Slavic hinterlands, the vast interior lands of Eastern Europe, proved to be the most consistent and abundant source of slaves. The word slave itself is believed by many historians to derive from Slav, a chilling testament to the scale of the Viking operation in the East. The supply was endless, and the demand from the wealthy Byzantine Empire and the massive Islamic Caliphate was insatiable. The Vikings were the ruthless and efficient middlemen, bridging the gap between the forests where people were captured and the rich markets where they were sold. While the eastern routes were crucial, the trade in Western Europe was centralized, violent and highly profitable. The city of Dublin, founded by Norsemen, became the most notorious slave market in Western Europe. It was here that captured Irish, Anglo-Saxons and Scots were collected, sorted and prepared for sale. The wealth of the Norse king of Dublin was directly proportionate to the flow of human misery through its docks. The quality of the slave determined the price. Young strongmen fetched high prices for labor or military service. Women were valued for domestic service and, often, as concubines. Children were prized for their long-term labor potential. This was a brutal trade. The slaves were marched, shackled across Europe, or endured terrifying passages across the open ocean, often on the same longships that had brought their captors such glory. The profits were used not for fleeting pleasures, but to reinvest in the core Viking businesses: better ships, more land, and political power. In the east, the scale was even larger, fueled by the staggering silver of the Islamic world. Along the Volga and Dnieper rivers, as detailed in the previous chapter, the Rus Vikings established themselves as slave-trading barons. They built fortified settlements like Novgorod and Kiev, not just to trade furs, but to process and move human cargo south toward the Byzantine Empire's capital, Constantinople, and the Islamic Caliphate's major cities. Arab travelers, such as Ibn Fadlan, left chilling accounts of their encounters with the Rus traders. They described the Rus ships docking, laden with slaves, and the brutal public nature of the sales. A thrall was treated purely as a commodity, examined, traded for silver, and moved on. The Islamic world, with its enormous populations and wealth, provided a market that Western Europe simply could not match. The system was so successful that it fundamentally changed the power balance in the north. A petty jarl who owned enough longships and was successful at capturing enough thralls could quickly amass the wealth to challenge a king. Slavery was the true aristocracy of the Viking world. The result of this vast trade was an unprecedented flood of silver into Scandinavia. For the Vikings, silver was the one true currency, portable, durable, and universally valued, but it was not European silver. The churches of Britain and France provided initial seed money, but the bulk of Viking wealth, the foundation of their entire economy, came from the Islamic world in the form of Kufic dirhams. These coins, minted in Baghdad and other caliphate centers, are the most tangible evidence of the East-West connection. In treasure hoards across Denmark, Sweden and Norway, archaeologists have unearthed tens of thousands of these silver dirhams, far outnumbering the total amount of coins circulating in Western Europe at the time. The Vikings became expert numismatists, judging the purity and weight of the silver. But they did not use the coins as currency in the modern sense. They used a system known as hack silver. Hack silver was the purest expression of the Viking economy. Instead of recognizing the coin's face value, the Vikings treated the dirham, or any silver item from bracelets to bullion, as raw metal. They would chop it up or hack it into small pieces. When a Viking wanted to buy goods, he didn't count coins, he weighed silver. He would produce a small scale, the single most important tool of any successful Viking trader, and weigh out the exact amount of hack silver needed for the transaction. This system was fair, efficient, and recognized no national border, no political authority, and no religious difference. It was the first universal currency of its kind. This overwhelming wealth in silver had a transformative effect. Political power. Silver financed the permanent settlements and the armies needed to defend them, enabling figures like Alfred the Great's contemporary Guthrum to settle in and rule the Danelaw technological advancement. It paid for the iron, the skilled labor, and the provisions needed to build the larger, more ambitious longships required for deeper ocean voyages. Social mobility. The successful raider or trader, having amassed a fortune in dirhams and thralls, could purchase land and enter the Jarl class, disrupting the traditional hereditary power structure. The economic triumph of the Vikings came at an immense, brutal cost. Their success was built on the collapse of security across a continent and the capture of hundreds of thousands of lives. It is impossible to overstate the importance of the thrall to Viking society. They cleared the land, built the settlements, and provided the basic labor that freed up the carl, the free man, to do what he did best: fight, trade, and explore. Without the vast wealth generated by the sale of human beings in the East, and without the subsequent influx of Islamic silver, the Vikings would have remained small-time pirates. They would not have possessed the resources, the motivation, or the sheer political muscle to finance the next great phase of their story. For having exhausted the best targets in Europe and having filled their treasuries with foreign silver, their attention turned once again to the ultimate frontier, the open, terrifying North Atlantic. They needed land. They needed a new, untouched, defenseless horizon. The wealth they accumulated through blood and bondage would now buy them the vessels and the supplies for the greatest discovery of the Middle Ages. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, the Viking world was changing. The easy plunder of England was largely over. The kingdoms of Western Europe were stronger, and the lucrative trade routes in the east were now guarded by established Rus states. The great period of raiding was giving way to settlement and the search for new opportunities. For generations, Norse sailors had known of a vast, empty expanse to the west, beyond the northern coasts of Scotland and Ireland. It was a place of myth and rumor, a land of ice and fire that lay at the very edge of the known world. This was the call of the unknown, the same spirit that would one day draw settlers to the American frontier. For the Vikings, the search was for land. Good land, free land, where a man could escape the taxes of a king or the feuds of his neighbors and start anew. The first major discovery in the North Atlantic was unintentional. In the mid-9th century, a Norwegian Viking named Nadod was blown off course while sailing to the Faroe Islands. He sighted a vast landmass, snow-covered, and named it Snaeland, Snowland. He returned to Norway, his story adding to the growing whispers of lands far to the west. The true discovery and initial settlement came in the 870s, led by another, Norwegian Ingolfur Arnarsson. According to the sagas, Ingolfur, seeking to escape political feuds and the centralizing power of Norway, led a deliberate expedition. Upon sighting the coast, he cast his wooden high-seat pillars overboard, vowing to settle wherever the gods washed them ashore. He eventually found them on a southwestern peninsula and founded his farm at Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, named for the geothermal steam rising from the ground. Iceland was an extraordinary challenge. It was a land of raw, volcanic power, treeless, plains and unforgiving weather, but critically, it was also terra nullius, empty land, free for the taking. Thousands of Norwegians, and later Danes, Swedes and even Norse Gaelic settlers from Ireland and Scotland flocked to the island. They brought their traditions, their laws, their language, their sheep, and their cows. They established the Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament, a direct democracy where free men debated laws and settled disputes. Iceland became a fiercely independent Norse republic, a pure distillation of Viking culture, untainted by the kings of Europe. But even this vast island had its limits. Good grazing land was finite, the climate was harsh, and soon the adventurous spirit of the Northmen sought something even further, something even more extreme. The next great leap across the Atlantic was driven, as so many Viking expansions were, by exile and ambition. This time the figure at the heart of the story was Erik Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Erik the Red. Erik was a man of immense physical presence, a fiery temper, and a notorious penchant for violence. He embodied the fierce independence of the Norse settlers. He was born in Norway, but his family fled to Iceland after his father was banished for manslaughter. The blood feud, however, followed Erik. In Iceland, he himself was involved in a series of violent disputes, culminating in multiple killings. As a result, Erik the Red was declared an outlaw and banished from Iceland for 3 years. For most men, this would have meant ruin. For Erik, it meant opportunity. He had heard tantalizing rumors from a sailor named Gunnbjörn Ulfsson, who, centuries earlier, had been blown off course and sighted land far to the west of Iceland. Erik decided to pursue those rumors. He would use his exile to find his own land, his own kingdom, far from the reach of any law. In 982 AD, Erik the Red sailed west from Iceland, his longship cutting through the icy swells of the North Atlantic. He sailed for days, then weeks, until a new coastline emerged from the fog. What he found was a land of staggering contrasts. Vast, imposing glaciers dominated the interior, a desolate, frozen expanse. But along the southwestern coast, Erik discovered sheltered fjords that stretched deep inland, protected from the worst of the Arctic winds. Here, the land was surprisingly fertile for a northern latitude, with green pastures in the summer. Erik was a shrewd marketer. He understood that to attract settlers to this remote, challenging land, he needed a compelling name. He called it Greenland. The name was a calculated deception, designed to entice. It worked. He spent his 3 years of exile meticulously exploring the habitable fjords, charting the coastline, and identifying the best sites for future farms. He returned to Iceland a changed man, not an outlaw, but a visionary. Erik the Red's description of Greenland's green pastures and fertile land ignited the imagination of the land-hungry Icelanders. In 985 AD, he led a massive colonization. Fleet, 25 longships laden with families, livestock, tools, and provisions. It was a perilous journey. The treacherous waters of the Denmark Strait, with its ice flows and unpredictable storms, claimed many. Only 14 of the 25 ships are believed to have successfully reached the shores of Greenland, but those who made it established 2 major settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, deep within the southern fjords. They built farms, houses, and eventually churches. They cultivated barley, raised sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. They hunted seals, walruses, and polar bears for meat, furs, and ivory, especially the valuable walrus ivory, which became a crucial export. Greenland was a success, a testament to Viking ingenuity and their incredible endurance. It became a thriving Norse colony, maintaining ties with Iceland and Norway for centuries, sustained by hunting, fishing, and the harsh-won produce of their farms. It was a land far removed from the centers of European power, a testament to a people who would rather brave the unknown than submit to the will of a king. The establishment of Greenland was not the end of the westward journey. In fact, it was merely a stepping stone. From the high, frozen cliffs of Greenland, another landmass was sometimes visible on clear days, shimmering on the distant horizon, a hint of something even further, something unknown. This tantalizing glimpse, combined with the continuous Viking hunger for more resources, more timber and better land, would inevitably draw their longships further west. It was from these new, rugged outposts on the edge of the Arctic Circle that the greatest journey of the Viking Age, the discovery of an entire new continent, would finally begin. The son of Erik the Red, Leif Erikson, would soon take up the call of the horizon. The Norse settlement of Greenland, achieved by Erik the Red, was not the final frontier. It was merely the jumping-off point, the final spectacular leap into the unknown was about to be made by his son, Leif Erikson, a man whose legacy would echo through North American history, though often overshadowed by the later voyages of Columbus. The sagas tell us that the initial sighting of North America was once again accidental. Around the year 986 AD, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to join the new colony in Greenland. He was blown far off course by heavy winds. When the fog lifted, Bjarni sighted a coastline utterly unlike the volcanic black sands of Iceland or the glacial white cliffs of Greenland. This land was low, heavily forested, and lushly green. Bjarni, committed to finding his father in Greenland, did not land. He simply marked the coastline in his mind and sailed on. But upon his return, Bjarni's tale of this new wooded land quickly spread among the resource-starved Greenlanders. They desperately needed timber. Greenland had almost none, and they longed for better grazing land. Around the year 1000 AD, the ambitious son of Erik the Red, Leif Erikson, purchased Bjarni's ship. Leif had recently traveled to Norway, where he had been converted to Christianity. He returned to Greenland with two goals: to spread the Christian faith and to find this legendary western land. Leif set off with a crew of 35 men, reversing Bjarni's route precisely. This was not a random drift. This was a deliberate, calculated voyage of discovery. Leif Erikson and his men sighted the landmass exactly where Bjarni had described it. But Leif took the crucial step. He landed. The first land they encountered was stark and forbidding. It was a place of flat, bare rock, slate and barren glacier, a landscape Leif immediately named Helluland, flat stone land. Modern historians believe this was likely Baffin Island, the vast, desolate northern stretch of what is now Canada. It was not a place for settlement, but it confirmed the rumors. The Norse were now undeniably looking at an entirely new continent. Sailing south, they soon reached a second, more appealing coast. This land was heavily wooded, dense with tall timber, perfect for the construction and repair of their ships and houses. Leif named this area Markland, Forest Land. This is generally agreed to be the coastal region of Labrador. This was an incredible find. Timber was the lifeblood of Norse civilization, and here it was, in limitless supply. But Leif knew there was still better land to be found. He sailed on for 2 more days. Finally, they reached a place of profound beauty. The air was milder, the grass was richer, and the rivers were full of salmon, the largest they had ever seen. The winter snows were less severe than in Greenland. Leif decided to settle here for the entire winter. During their exploration, one of Leif's German crewmen, named Turka, reportedly discovered grapes growing wild. Grapes were a staggering sign of fertility and warmth for men used to the Arctic Circle. Leif named this place Vinland, Wineland, or possibly Pasture Land. The exact location of Vinland has been the subject of fierce debate for centuries. However, the discovery of a Norse settlement site at Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, has provided definitive archaeological proof that the Vikings were, in fact, the first Europeans to set foot on North American soil. Nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland, bringing back a rich cargo of lumber and the incredible news of this promised land. He had fulfilled his destiny. He inherited the chieftainship after his father's death, and known thereafter as Leif the Lucky, did not return to Vinland. The lure of Vinland was too strong to resist. The greatest effort at permanent colonization was led by a wealthy Icelandic merchant, Thorfinn Karlsefni, who married Leif's sister-in-law, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. Around 1010 AD, Karlsefni organized the largest expedition yet. 3 ships and 160 people, and a massive stock of livestock, including bulls, which were critical for a proper farm settlement. This was not a raid. This was a serious attempt at establishing a permanent North American colony. They settled at Leif's base in Vinland. The first year was a Norse dream. They fished, they hunted, and they harvested timber. Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Thorfinnsson, believed to be the first European child born in the Americas. But the dream quickly turned into a brutal nightmare. The Vikings were not alone. The land was already inhabited by native peoples whom the Norse sagas called Skraelings, a term that meant wretches or shriekers. These were likely ancestors of the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq peoples. The initial encounters were cautious and even involved a brief period of trade. The Skraelings were fascinated by the Norse tools, particularly the red cloth, for which they eagerly traded furs. The Vikings, in turn, were interested in the furs, but the cultural gap was immense and bridged only by mistrust. The Norse were aggressively proprietary about the land they claimed, and the Skraelings were understandably hostile toward the sudden appearance of armed foreign settlers with strange customs and powerful animals. The conflict began with a seemingly minor incident involving a bull, part of Karlsefni's livestock, which bellowed and terrified the Skraelings. Tensions escalated into outright violence, the first recorded armed conflict between Europeans and Native Americans. The Norse were fierce warriors, but they faced 2 critical disadvantages. Numbers. The Skraelings greatly outnumbered the small settlement of 160 people. Logistics. The supply line back to Greenland and then Iceland was impossibly long and dangerous. They were utterly isolated, 3,000 miles from any friendly port. The Vikings were masters of war, but they realized that a permanent war against an inexhaustible, localized population was unwinnable. Karlsefni's colony lasted perhaps only 3 years before the continuous skirmishes and the constant threat of attack made settlement untenable. Karlsefni, recognizing the danger to his people, made the pragmatic, necessary decision to abandon Vinland. They packed up their livestock, their lumber, and their young son, Snorri, and sailed back to Greenland, ending the great experiment in North American colonization. The North American continent was not conquered. It was rejected. The Vikings' ambition had surpassed their capability. The lack of political centralization, the inability to defend such a vast supply chain, and the fierce resistance of the native peoples were all factors that conspired to force their withdrawal. The saga of Vinland faded into memory, preserved only in the Icelandic sagas until the archaeological finds of the 20th century. 500 years before the ships of Spain arrived, the dragon heads of the Norse had already carved their name into the vast, silent history of America. The saga of Vinland, the Viking attempt to colonize North America, was a story of staggering success immediately followed by profound, necessary failure. The expeditions led by Leif Erikson and Thorfinn Karlsefni proved that the Norse were the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic and establish a presence on American soil, but they could not hold it. The question remains, if Vinland was indeed the fertile, rich land described in the sagas, Why did the mighty Vikings, who had conquered kingdoms and settled volcanic islands, abandon the entire continent? The answer lies in three cold, hard realities that Karlsefni's settlers could not overcome. The primary reason for the withdrawal was the local resistance. The native peoples of Vinland, the Skrælings, were not passive targets. They were numerous, organized and fiercely defensive of their ancestral lands. While the Vikings possessed superior metal weaponry, the Skrælings possessed something far more powerful: local knowledge and overwhelming numbers. Every time the Norse encountered them, it led to conflict. The sagas describe the natives using simple, effective tactics, and perhaps most frighteningly to the Vikings, a catapult or some type of powerful throwing weapon that terrified the Norse warriors. The Vikings were simply too few to sustain a permanent military occupation. Unlike their conquest of Ireland, where they could retreat to fortified coastal bases and receive reinforcements from Norway, Vinland was entirely cut off. Every lost warrior was an irreplaceable loss to the small colony. The cost in blood and manpower quickly outweighed the value of the land. The supply chain was impossible. The Norse world had stretched itself past its breaking point. To survive, the Vinland colony depended on trade, communication, and occasional resupply from Greenland and, ultimately, Iceland. The journey from Iceland to Newfoundland involved crossing the entire North Atlantic, a voyage spanning thousands of miles of unpredictable seas, icebergs, and hurricane-force storms. When Karlsefni's colony required new supplies or fresh settlers, the journey could take months, and the success rate was far from guaranteed. The Viking economy, as we saw in the previous chapter, was dependent on slave labor and the flow of silver. In Vinland, they could capture slaves, but they could not easily sell them or receive the silver needed to purchase iron and other necessities back home. The logistical complexity created a settlement that could not sustain itself, making it a drain on the already fragile Greenland colony rather than a viable source of profit. Ultimately, the goal changed. The Vikings were not nation builders in the mold of the later Spanish or English empires. They were free individuals, driven by the search for personal wealth and independent farmland. When the cost of living in Vinland became perpetual, deadly warfare, and when the value of the timber they acquired didn't justify the constant risk, the settlers retreated to a place that was still profitable and far safer: Greenland. The Viking withdrawal was not a rout of utter military defeat, but a pragmatic economic calculation, a clear assessment that the enterprise was simply not worth the ongoing expenditure of blood and resources. The Northmen packed up their supplies, their precious lumber, and the incredible memories, and vanished from the American coastline. For centuries, the story of Vinland remained just that, a story. The heroic sagas were dismissed by most historians as charming medieval fantasy, a boastful national legend. No educated person believed that Europeans had been to America before 1492. Then, in the early 1960s, a monumental discovery was made on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, Canada. A Norwegian explorer and writer, Helge Ingstad, and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, were following the geographical descriptions laid out in the ancient sagas. They were led to a desolate coastal spot known as Meadows, a small, windswept bay. Here they unearthed undeniable proof: the ruins of 8 turf and wood structures built in an unmistakable Norse architectural style. The finds were electric. They uncovered a classic Viking spindle whirl used for spinning yarn, a clear sign of domestic settlement by women, a small bronze pin in the Norse style. Most crucially, a Norse forge and iron slag, proving that the Vikings smelted and worked iron on the site. Since Native American cultures in this area did not possess iron-working technology, this was irrefutable evidence of a European presence. The dating of the artifacts placed the occupation definitively around the year 1000 AD, exactly when the sagas claimed Leif Erikson had sailed west. Meadows was confirmed as the long-sought Viking base camp in North America, the true Vinland. The discovery fundamentally rewrote the timeline of global exploration. It proved that the Vikings, through their simple quest for land and resources, had connected the hemispheres 5 centuries before the age of exploration officially began. While the Vinland experiment was short-lived, the Viking colonies on Greenland survived and thrived for over 450 years. For centuries, the Greenland settlers maintained their Norse identity, their farms, and their connection to Norway and Iceland, mainly through the lucrative trade in walrus ivory. But gradually, the world changed, and the isolation that had once protected them now doomed them. Climate change. Starting around 1300 AD, the Little Ice Age began. The fjords froze earlier and stayed frozen longer, shortening the grazing season and making the treacherous journey from Iceland nearly impossible. The Black Death. The Great Plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, decimating the populations of Norway and Iceland and shattering the ability of the homeland to send supply ships or settlers. European competition. European markets found a cheaper, more reliable source of ivory from Africa, destroying the economic basis of the Greenland colony. The vital ships stopped arriving. The Norse settlers, cut off from iron and supplies, watched as their farms failed and the sea lanes closed. When the final European expeditions reached the settlements in the 15th and 16th centuries, they found only ruins. The farms were abandoned, the churches stood empty, and the cemeteries held the final resting places of a people who had simply vanished. The last written record of the Norse in Greenland dates to 1408 AD. The final fate of the remaining settlers is unknown. Did they starve? Did they sail away? Did they assimilate with the local Inuit population? We may never know. The Viking Age, an era defined by bold expansion, unstoppable hunger for wealth and mastery of the seas, did not end in a glorious battle. It ended in silence on the frigid, isolated fjords of Greenland, the last bastion of their incredible world-spanning empire. The story of the Vikings is the story of pioneering courage and the brutal lessons of history, that the greatest ambition cannot overcome the combined forces of economics, warfare, and nature. By the middle of the 11th century, the Viking Age, the period defined by aggressive, opportunistic expansion, was in its twilight. The raiders who had terrorized Europe were now settling down. The descendants of the warrior monks who fought Alfred the Great were now Norman dukes who spoke French and built stone castles. The Rus traders were establishing the Slavic kingdoms of the East. The final end of the Viking Age was not a single moment, but a series of climactic battles that marked the permanent conversion of the Norse spirit from piracy to permanent kingship. The final, decisive drama would play out on English soil, a land where the Viking legacy was arguably strongest. After the successes of Alfred the Great, England was not permanently saved from Scandinavian rule. In the early 11th century, the great King Knut the Great, a Dane, conquered England, uniting it with Norway and Denmark into a vast, powerful North Sea empire. Knut, however, ruled not as a raider, but as a legitimate European king. He governed England fairly, issued laws, supported the church, and treated with continental monarchs. His empire was the ultimate Viking achievement. Rule consolidated through sophisticated political control, not just the axe. But Knut's empire was fragile, collapsing soon after his death. By 1042, the old Anglo-Saxon line was briefly restored under Edward the Confessor, When Edward died without an heir in early 1066, the political vacuum sucked in the three fiercest claimants to the English crown, two of them Vikings. The most formidable of these claimants was Harald Sigurdsson, known as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler, King of Norway. Harald Hardrada was the last true Norse warrior king. His life was an astonishing saga of adventure and warfare. He had not only fought across Scandinavia, but had served as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire, leading the Varangian Guard and fighting in the courts of Constantinople before returning to claim the throne of Norway. He was legendary for his size, his ruthlessness, and his insatiable ambition. For Harald, England was the ultimate prize, a land that had once belonged to his Viking predecessors. In the summer of 1066, he launched a massive invasion fleet, sailing toward the north of England with his longships packed with Norway's elite fighting force, aiming to seize the throne from the newly crowned English king, Harold Godwinson. The invasion was initially devastatingly successful. Hardrada's army crushed the English resistance forces at the Battle of Fulford, opening the road to York. The Viking dream of ruling a permanent North Sea empire was within reach. However, King Harold Godwinson, the English monarch, was a general of remarkable speed and resolve. He had anticipated an invasion from the south, but upon learning of Hardrada's attack, he force-marched his army, covering nearly 200 miles in less than 5 days, to meet the Norse threat. The two armies met on September 25, 1066, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge near York. The battle itself was a brutal, ferocious melee. The Norwegian army, caught off guard, initially fought with the desperation that had characterized the Viking Age. At one point, a legendary Norse champion held the narrow bridge alone, killing dozens of Englishmen before being dispatched. But the sheer speed and unexpected fury of the English counterattack, combined with the extreme heat of the late summer day, shattered the Norwegian shield wall. The climax of the battle came when Harald Hardrada, fighting at the front of his line, was struck down by an arrow likely through his throat. With their legendary leader dead, the Norwegian morale broke. The army was decimated. Of the hundreds of longships that had sailed to England, legend claims that only 24 were needed to carry the few survivors back to Norway. Stamford Bridge was the final definitive death knell for the Viking Age of expansion. It shattered the military power of the last great Viking king and permanently broke Norway's ability to project aggressive force across the North Sea. The era of the Norse raider was over. The irony of this victory is that King Harold Godwinson had barely finished celebrating his triumph before a third claimant, William, Duke of Normandy, landed his forces in the south of England. William was himself a direct descendant of the Viking raiders who had settled in France 2 centuries earlier, carving out the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen. He spoke French, not Old Norse, and fought with continental knights and tactics, not the Viking shield wall. Just 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson and his exhausted army were defeated by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. England was not freed from foreign rule. It was simply taken over by a new wave of conquerors, Vikings who had evolved into French-speaking feudal lords. The new Norman rulers brought an end to the Anglo-Saxon way of life and cemented England firmly into the feudal political and cultural structure of continental Europe. The transformation was now complete across Scandinavia itself. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, having spent centuries sending their best warriors and settlers abroad, now settled into being distinct Christian European kingdoms. Christianity replaced the old Norse pantheon. Kings like Norway's Olaf II, who died trying to force Christianity on his people, were eventually made saints, ironically sealing the transformation from pagan warrior to pious monarch. Feudalism replaced the old Jarl system. Taxes, bureaucracy, and permanent armies superseded the decentralized system of independent raiders. Global integration. Scandinavian kingdoms stopped being exporters of violence and became integrated members of the European trade network, relying on established ports and continental alliances rather than plunder. The Viking, the man who lived by the axe and the sea, did not truly disappear. He was simply transformed, his relentless energy channeled into new avenues, founding the aristocracy of England and France, pioneering the great trade routes of Russia, and securing the far-flung islands of the North Atlantic. The spirit of exploration that drove Leif Erikson to Vinland would eventually be taken up by the ships of Spain, Portugal, and England centuries later. The Viking was the terrifying necessary bridge between the chaotic Dark Ages and the rise of the modern European state. They had started as pirates seeking survival and ended as kings who redefined the map of the world. And that, in the final accounting, is the true legacy of the blood and the fury of the Norse. The Viking Age, defined by the centuries between the terror of Lindisfarne and the final arrow at Stamford Bridge, was not merely an era of raiding. It was a period of unparalleled globalization, powered by blood, trade, and the spirit of exploration. The Norse did not just influence history. In many ways, they made it. The great longships, the ultimate expression of Viking ingenuity, carried their civilization to the very edges of the known world, leaving a permanent legacy that echoes in the modern age. For the American audience, the most fascinating legacy is the discovery of the Americas. The story of Leif Erikson and the settlements in Vinland irrevocably changes the narrative of world history. The Vikings proved that the Atlantic was not an insurmountable barrier, paving the way for the later voyages that would redefine the world. But the Viking footprint is found far deeper than just a few abandoned settlements. Language, the English. Language is saturated with Norse influence. Words like law, husband, skill, take, and knife, and even the pronoun they, are all derived from Old Norse, integrated into the language through the Danelaw settlements. Genetics, studies of coastal populations in the British Isles and beyond, reveal lasting genetic links to Scandinavia, a physical testament to the settlements and assimilation that occurred after the initial raids. Geopolitics. The Viking system of river trade on the Volga and Dnieper gave rise to the Rus kingdoms, making them the direct forefathers of the vast states of Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, the Norman dukes, descendants of the raiders, conquered England and laid the foundation for the political structure of the medieval world. They were brutal, yes. They were terrifying, absolutely. But they were also brilliant navigators, shrewd merchants, democratic pioneers in Iceland, and master administrators under figures like Knut the Great. The true story of the Viking is one of adaptation. They came from a brutal, uncompromising land, and they succeeded because they were willing to change. When the axe was no longer profitable, they picked up the ledger. When their home was too crowded, they sailed into the blinding Arctic north to find Greenland and Vinland. The Viking did not fear the unknown. He saw it as an opportunity. His courage laid the foundation for empires he would never see and discoveries he could never have imagined. Tonight you have journeyed across continents and centuries, tracing the path of the axe and the cross, the blood and the gold. The age of the Longship is over, but the spirit of the North, that fierce, unyielding drive to conquer nature, discover frontiers, and seek freedom beyond the king's reach, that spirit remains a powerful, compelling current in the bloodline of Western civilization. Thank you for listening to the true story of the Vikings. Blood, trade, and the discovery of America on History by Blood audiobook. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of the Norse, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you unique, long-form historical audiobooks. Let us know in the comments below. Which Viking figure, Leif Erikson, Harald Hardrada, or Alfred the Great, do you think had the greatest impact on history?